binding off for an underarm. Now, you kind of have to make a plan for this because you have to think about how you're going to put it together later. I personally know that I'm going to put this together on the machine, so I'm going to use an around the gate peg bind off to give me plenty of space to pick up those stitches to join it on the machine. Now, I have to go down to 85 stitches from 100 on either side of 0, which means that on the first pass, I am going to bind off 15 stitches on the carriage side, knit 1 row, and then bind off 15 stitches on the other side. But what happens when you bind off in the middle of a piece? You get a hole between your bind off and your knit. So as I'm binding this off, I'm thinking about that in my head. And there's a little trick that I do that helps to alleviate that. So what I'm actually going to do is bind off 14 stitches. And my 15th stitch, I'm going to hang on the adjacent needle with the other live stitch. And I'm going to do a knit 2 together or a slip slip knit depending on which way it's leaning, and allow the carriage to bind off that final stitch. I'm also going to pull up on the yarn as it comes out of the carriage to make sure that the last stitch that I bound off by hand is very short and tight. And you want to do that because it keeps your fabric from gapping apart. And that helps to alleviate that strange little underarm hole that happens. This is also a good trick for your neckline if you're binding off at your neckline. Make sure that you A, wrap the needle next to your first bind off stitch like you were short rowing, and then B, your final bind off stitch should just be a knit 2 together or a slip slip knit, again depending on the direction of the lean. Now this section of the film is time lapse, so I'm just voicing over. What you'll see is I've done an around the gate peg bind off, but what that does is it keeps the fabric on the machine. So what you need to do is knit that first row to get the carriage down to the other side, and then you can very gently lift the piece off the gate pegs. And then you're going to repeat the whole process for the other side because you can't bind off both sides at once. Your yarn is not in the right place. Now you could, of course, put the needles into hold for the other side and then bind them off, but then what you end up with is your yarn is at the end of the piece when it needs to be 15 stitches to the right or left. So it's much better to do your underarm bind off in 2 rows than to attempt to do it in 1. Now I have done this with tension playing and done a loop to loop bind off, but it doesn't look as nice and it will show that much more in your seam.